Imagine standing in the shadow of a crumbling castle, the air thick with the weight of centuries-old screams. What if I told you one man's name still sends shivers down Europe's spine, his brutal punishments so horrifying they've become the stuff of nightmares? Vlad the Impaler. His legend is no fairy tale. It's a blood-soaked saga of vengeance, power, and terror that haunts us even today. Why does his story refuse to die? Stick with me because we're diving deep into the darkest corners of history to uncover truths that'll leave you speechless. Let's set the scene. It's the 15th century and Europe is a chaotic mess. The Ottoman Empire is knocking at the door, hungry for conquest. Wallachia, a small region in what's now Romania, is caught in the crossfire. This is where Vlad III, known as Vlad Tepes or the Impaler, steps into history. Born around 1431, Vlad wasn't just another medieval ruler. He was a man forged in betrayal, captivity, and a relentless drive to protect his land, no matter the cost. To Americans he might sound like a character from a horror movie, but to Europeans, especially in Romania, he's a complex figure. A hero to some, a monster to others. Picture a young Vlad, barely a teenager, handed over as a hostage to the Ottomans by his own father. Can you imagine the rage, the helplessness? 4 years he lived among his enemies, learning their ways, their weaknesses, all while plotting his return. That time shaped him, hardened him. When he finally claimed the throne of Wallachia in 1456, he wasn't just fighting for power, he was fighting for survival. The Ottomans wanted his land. His own nobles schemed against him. Vlad decided he'd rule with fear because fear, he believed, was the only language his enemies understood. Now let's talk about the punishments that earned him his gruesome nickname. Vlad's signature method was impalement, a slow, agonizing death where a sharpened stake was driven through the body, often from the base up, leaving the victim to writhe in pain for hours, sometimes days. It wasn't just about killing, it was about sending a message. He'd lined forests with thousands of staked bodies, creating grotesque displays that horrified anyone who dared approach. One chronicler wrote of a Turkish army turning back in terror at the sight of 20,000 impaled corpses rotting along the Danube. Can you picture that? A field of death so vast it broke the will of an empire. But Vlad's cruelty wasn't random. He targeted traitors, thieves, and enemies with surgical precision. In one story he invited disloyal nobles to a grand feast, only to have them arrested and impaled outside the dining hall. Another time he dealt with poverty in his capital by gathering the poor for a lavish meal, then locking the doors and burning the building to the ground. His logic? Eliminate the weak to strengthen the state. To modern ears this sounds like madness, but in Vlad's world it was strategy. He believed a ruler had to be feared to be respected. Let's pause for a moment. As an American you might hear this and think, this guy was a psychopath. But in Eastern Europe, especially Romania, Vlad's legacy is more nuanced. To many he was a defender of his people against overwhelming odds. The Ottomans weren't just invaders, they were an existential threat. Vlad's brutal tactics kept them at bay when others fell. I've spoken to friends in Bucharest who still toast to Vlad as a national hero, a man who did what was necessary. Yet even they shudder at the stories of his punishments. It's this duality, hero and villain, that keeps his legend alive. Let's dig deeper into one of the most chilling episodes, the night attack of 1462. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, fresh off conquering Constantinople, set his sights on Wallachia. He marched with an army of 90,000 men, outnumbering Vlad's forces 3-1. Vlad didn't have the numbers, but he had cunning. Under cover of darkness, he launched a daring raid on the Ottoman camp, aiming to kill Mehmed himself. His men struck like phantoms, sowing chaos, but Mehmed escaped. Furious, Vlad retreated, but not before leaving a parting gift, that infamous forest of impaled bodies. The Sultan, hardened by years of war, was reportedly so shaken he called off the campaign. That's the power of Vlad's terror. Why did Vlad go to such extremes? Part of it was psychological warfare. In a time when battles were won by breaking morale, Vlad was a master. He didn't just want to defeat his enemies, he wanted to haunt them. But there's more to it. Vlad grew up in a world where betrayal was routine. His father was assassinated. His brother was blinded with hot irons before being buried alive. Vlad learned early that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Every stake he drove into the ground was a warning. Cross me and this is your fate. Let's shift gears and explore how Vlad's story became a legend. After his death in 1476, likely betrayed and killed in battle, tales of his cruelty spread like wildfire. German pamphlets, printed in the early days of the printing press, painted him as a bloodthirsty tyrant. These were like the tabloids of the time, exaggerating stories to shock readers. One claimed Vlad dined among his impaled victims, dipping his bread in their blood. Another said he boiled children alive. Were these true? Probably not. But they stuck, especially in Western Europe, where Vlad became a bogeyman. Then came the Dracula connection. In the 19th century, Bram Stoker stumbled across Vlad's story while researching his novel. The name Dracula, derived from Vlad's father's title, Dracul meaning dragon, inspired Stoker's iconic vampire. Suddenly, Vlad wasn't just a historical figure. He was the blueprint for a monster who's been terrifying audiences for over a century. From Bela Lugosi's Cape to Netflix's latest vampire flick, Vlad's shadow looms large. But here's the kicker. Romanians don't see him as a vampire. To them, the Dracula myth is a Western invention, a distortion of their history. Let's talk about why Vlad's punishments still resonate. In Europe, especially in places like Romania and Hungary, his story is woven into the cultural fabric. Castles like Bran and Poenary, linked to Vlad, draw thousands of tourists chasing his legend. I visited Bran Castle once, and the air felt heavy, like the walls were whispering secrets. Locals will tell you stories passed down for generations, how Vlad's enemies trembled at his name, how his justice was swift and merciless. These aren't just tales, they're a reminder of a time when survival meant embracing the darkness. For Americans, Vlad's story taps into something primal, the fascination with true crime and larger-than-life figures. Think about it. Our podcasts and Netflix specials are full of serial killers and warlords. Vlad fits right in, but he's more than that. He's a paradox. Was he a sadist or a savior? A monster or a patriot? This ambiguity is why we can't stop talking about him. Every time a new book or movie comes out, we're drawn back to his world, trying to unravel the truth. Let's consider the broader impact. Vlad's tactics influenced how rulers wielded fear. His psychological warfare predated modern concepts like propaganda or deterrence. In a way, he was ahead of his time, using terror as a tool when others relied on swords. But there's a cost. His brutality alienated allies, and his enemies used his reputation to justify their own aggression. By the time he died, Wallachia was still standing, but Vlad's legacy was a double-edged sword. Hero to his people, villain to the world. Now let's get personal. I've always been drawn to stories like Vlad's because they force us to confront uncomfortable questions. What would you do to protect your home, your family? Would you cross lines, break rules, become the monster to defeat one? Vlad's story isn't just about the past. It's about the choices we make when the stakes are high. I think that's why his legend endures, especially in America, where we love stories of defiance against impossible odds. Let's explore another angle. The myths versus the reality. Historians argue over how much of Vlad's cruelty was exaggerated. Some say the German pamphlets were propaganda, spread by his enemies to demonize him. Others point to Ottoman chronicles, which, while critical, confirm his ruthless tactics. The truth likely lies in between. Vlad was brutal, no question, but he wasn't a cartoonish villain. He was a man of his time, shaped by a world where mercy was weakness. Understanding this doesn't excuse his actions, but it makes him human. Let's take a moment to visualize his world. Imagine Wallachia in the 1400s. Rugged mountains, dense forests, and fortified towns under constant threat. Vlad's capital, Targovist, was a hub of trade but also a target. His castles, perched on cliffs, were both fortresses and symbols of his power. If you've ever been to Eastern Europe, you know the landscape itself feels alive with history. The wind carries echoes of battles, betrayals, and yes, impalements. It's no wonder Vlad's story feels so visceral. Let's dive into a lesser-known story that shows Vlad's cunning. In 1460 he faced a rebellion from the city of Brashov, whose merchants were cozying up to his rivals. Vlad didn't just crush the rebellion, he turned it into a spectacle. He impaled the ringleaders on high stakes, visible from the city walls, and forced the survivors to march to Wallachia to build his fortress. It was a masterclass in control, punish, terrify, and rebuild. This wasn't just cruelty, it was theater designed to cement his authority. Why does this matter today? Vlad's story reminds us how history shapes identity. In Romania, he's a symbol of resistance, much like George Washington or Abraham Lincoln in America. But unlike those figures, Vlad's legacy is divisive. Some see him as a necessary evil, others a stain on history. This tension keeps his story alive in debates, books, and even video games. Every time we retell it, we're wrestling with the same question. Can the ends justify the means? Let's talk about the cultural ripple effects. Vlad's legend has inspired countless works, from Stoker's Dracula to modern horror. But it's not just fiction. In Romania, festivals celebrate his life, blending history with folklore. Tourists flock to Dracula's castle, buying vampire souvenirs while learning about the real Vlad. It's a strange mix of pride and commercialization, but it shows how his story transcends time. Even in America, where Halloween reigns supreme, Vlad's shadow adds a historical edge to our love of the macabre. Let's reflect on the human cost. Vlad's punishments didn't just kill, they traumatized. Families lost loved ones to his stakes. Communities lived in fear of his wrath. Yet, his defenders argue he saved more lives by holding back the Ottomans. It's a moral quagmire. As someone who's studied history, I find myself torn. Vlad's actions were horrific, but his context was brutal. Maybe that's why his story haunts us. It forces us to grapple with the gray areas of humanity. Let's bring it back to the present. Why should you, watching this in 2025, care about a 15th century warlord? Because Vlad's story is a mirror. It reflects our fascination with power, fear, and survival. It challenges us to think about leadership, morality, and the stories we tell ourselves. In a world of true crime podcasts and political divides, Vlad feels oddly relevant. His extremes make us question where we draw the line. As we wrap up, picture this. A moonlit night in Transylvania, the silhouette of a castle against the sky. Vlad's ghost doesn't haunt those walls, but his legacy does. Every story, every movie, every shiver down your spine traces back to him. He was a man who turned fear into a weapon, and in doing so became immortal. So what's the takeaway? Maybe it's this: history isn't just about facts, it's about the stories we choose to remember. If this story gripped you, hit that like button and share it with a friend who loves a good historical mystery. Drop a comment. Do you think Vlad was a hero, a villain, or something in between? And don't forget to subscribe because we've got more dark tales coming your way. Want another chilling story? Check out our next video. Nero's pathetic end was worse than you think. Trust me, you won't believe what went down. See you there.